Peace, everybody. Peace, peace. Welcome back to another Rational Lens podcast. I'm your host, Zuhudi Thutmose Menkefera. But you can call me by my regular name. I go by the name also of Rock Barzini. It's just another one of my monarchs. But welcome back. Today, we're going to be talking about George Washington and the rewriting of the Constitution of the United States, or should I say, the United States Corporation. George Washington, we know now that the information is out, wasn't the first president of the United States. You understand? But what a lot of people don't know, that George Washington, the picture that they showed George Washington, is not the original picture. George Washington also was a dark-skinned, melanated person that came from Europe. He was a Moor, and he was part of the elite Moors. When I say elite Moors, I mean those that came from the royal bloodline, those that sit amongst kings and queens and dukes and earls and esquires and counts and people of high stature. You understand? George Washington was one of those. He was a dark-skinned Moor. He had dark-skinned Moorish ancestry, meaning that he had black people in his family. And one of the black persons we're going to talk about who was an ancestor of George Washington is a guy by the name of Nicholas Martial. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. But Nicholas Martial. He was the ancestor of George Washington. And he was a dark-skinned Moor that came from France. Because we have to understand that when you go back to the Spanish Inquisition, when Spain was kicking the Jews and the Muslims out of Spain, these people were migrating to different places. You understand? One of the places that most of them migrated to, or I should say some of them migrated to, was France, South France. And those people became what you call the Huguenots. George Washington, we know, come from Huguenot ancestry, right? The Huguenots came from France. You understand? So we're going to talk about the Huguenots. We're going to talk about Nicholas Martial. We're going to talk about George Washington, and we're going to talk about the rewriting of the Constitution of the United States. Remember, I talked to y'all before. There were two United States. One that was created in 1776, and then you had one that was created in 1781. The one that was created in 1781 was incorporated in 1781, and George Washington was the president of that United States, the corporate United States. You understand? What you have to understand, during the American Revolution, when America was trying to shake off Britain, the Britain Empire, you understand? One of the things that happened was when the Britons set up the 13 colonies, these colonies were corporations. They were incorporated, you understand? And they were incorporated under the British Empire. We also have to take note that those settlers that came over here, those black conquistadors who were Moors, who came over here, who were either a part of the royal court or they were being funded by the royal court, you understand? They came over here under the jurisdiction of the royal crown. You understand? So what I mean by that, they were under the control and power of the royal crown, Britain. And the reason why they came over here, because there was a pact that was made amongst these elite Moors that all the land and resource that they found, they would share it, you understand, together. They would make money together. You understand? They would control it and make money and things of this nature together. But what happened was there was a conflict amongst the elite Moors with the taxation, because the Roman Empire wanted to tax the elite Moors that came over here, that helped them find America and set up the 13 colonies. You understand? So there was a conflict between the elite Moors, which were the royal bloodline that came from Europe. And those were your European settlers. Like I said before, when we talk about Europeans, the original Europeans weren't Caucasian. The original Europeans were dark-skinned, melanated people, and they were part of a royal bloodline. They were part of a royal court. You understand? And they came over here for land and resource. And when they came over here, they ran into what we call the Native Americans, or the Aboriginal indigenous people of America. And when they ran into these people, they made some type of treaty with these Native Americans, which were the 5 civilized tribes. So since I talked about the 5 civilized tribes, I talked about them before, so we're going to go over just a little recap who were the 5 civilized tribes of the United States before the elite Moors came over here. You understand? And a lot of dark-skinned people or melanated people up to today are related to these civilized tribes, and a lot of us are related to the black elite Moors that came from Europe, that came over here and settled and eventually took over resource and land and enslaved the indigenous Aboriginal people of America that was here first. You understand? Which were your 5 tribes. So let's just go over, recap quick, fast. So when we talk about the 5 tribes, the 5 tribes are your Cherokee, which a lot of us are Cherokee Indian, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole. The Creeks were known as the Muskogee. And then you also had your Iroquois Indians, and they created a federation which was known as the Iroquois Federation, which were your 6 Native American tribes, which were your Cayuga, your Seneca, your Mohawk, your Onondaga, and your Tuscarora. The Tuscarora Indians, they came from North Carolina, and they became part of the Iroquois Federation. And like I explained to y'all before, the Iroquois Confederation, they were the ones that set up the first constitution of the United States, which was known as the Constitution of Great Law and Peace. So under this constitution, these 6 tribes came together, and they created a treaty under this constitution. So you also had the Iroquois, and you also had the Algonquin, which came from North America, and you also had your Lenape. You understand? The Lenape were also Native Americans that were in New York, Delaware, Jersey, Philly, Pennsylvania, so forth. You understand? So you had all these different Native Americans that were here before your elite Moors came over here. You understand? But your 5 civilized tribes, which your elite Moors, who were European settlers that came over here for land and resource, they recognized these 5 tribes, which were known as your Cherokee, your Chickasaw, your Choctaw, and your Creek, and your Seminole. Right? Matter of fact, I'll give you a little bit more on each one of these tribes. So when we talk about your Cherokee, right, which were known as a nation, your Cherokee Nation, right? I'm gonna give you a little bit of history, not too much, because I don't want to get too much off the subject. But a lot of us are Cherokee Indian, and they were dark-skinned, melanated people. You understand? So it says the history of the Cherokee Nation, the European contact, settlement, and land cessions. The first contact between Cherokees and Europeans were in 1540 when Hernando de Soto and several hundred of his conquistadors. So remember, I told you about your black conquistadors. Get the book. It's a book called Black Conquistadors, and they tell you about all these black European settlers that came over here, that took land, resource, and enslaved the indigenous aboriginal people of the land, which now we call Native American. You understand? And not your Native Americans that we see now, which have the aquiline features and the straight hair. I'm talking about Native Americans that were big nose, big lips, high cheekbones, and nappy hair. You understand? They were your first Native Americans. And then later on, your Mongoloid people, or your Mongoloid prototype that came from Siberia, they came across the land bridge, the ice bridge into the Americas, and they mixed in with these melanated people and became family, and they started to share land and resource and traditions and culture and things of that nature with these Mongoloid prototype that came from the Siberia. You understand? And then that's how you got your Native Americans, how they look now with the straight hair and the alkaline features. You understand? They mixed in with your melanated, dark-skinned, Aboriginal indigenous people of America, which was your Choctaw, your Cherokee, your Seminole, your Muskogee, so forth. You understand? But right now we're talking about the history of the Cherokee Nation, European contact, the settlement, and land cessions. The first contact between the Cherokee and Europeans were in 1540 when Hernando de Soto, if you look into the records and there's certain books out, they tell you that he was dark-skinned. He was a black conquistador, right? He came over here in 1540, Hernando de Soto and several hundred of his conquistadors. So you hear that? Several hundred of his conquistadors. And they were dark-skinned elite Moors that came from Europe. You understand? They came from Spain, they came from Portugal, they came from France, they came from England, they came from the Netherlands, they came from Holland, they came from these different areas in Europe. You understand? And they came over here to the Americas as elite Moors, and they were the conquistadors that robbed and took land and resource and enslaved your Native Americans. You understand? But it says right here, Hernando de Soto and several hundreds of his conquistadors. So he came over here with hundreds of European settlers. And remember, when I talk about Europeans, I'm talking about dark-skinned people. The first Europeans were dark-skinned people. Right? It says they traveled through Cherokee territory during their expedition in what is now known as the southeastern United States. At the time, the nation held dominion over a sprawling territory comprised of much or most of the modern states of West Virginia, Kentucky, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, South Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama. So when we talk about our ancestors that came from the South, those black people that were in the South, which we know there was something called the Great Migration. The Great Migration is when all the black people from the South, you know what I'm saying, the Southern Ku Klux Klan South, you understand, they had to deal with slavery and racism and segregation and Jim Crow laws. You understand, a lot of them were raped, burnt, hung, whipped, abused. This is what was going on in the South during the Jim Crow era with the white KKK Southern people. You understand? This is what they were doing to blacks. And so a lot of blacks couldn't get jobs and make a living. So there was something called the Great Migration. The Great Migration, they came up north. You understand? And they came to these places of New York, Delaware, Pennsylvania, Maryland. They came to these upstate New York, Buffalo, Schenectady, these different places, and to make a living. So this was the Great Migration with the blacks. You understand? And a lot of your blacks were in West Virginia, Kentucky, Virginia, North America, the Carolinas, Tennessee, South Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama. When they came from, they were in the South and they came up north. So most of our ancestors come from the South, and they are a part of these 5 civilized tribes. You understand? It's Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Muskogee, Seminole, Iroquois, all these different Native American tribes that were in up north regional areas. You understand? So it says, at the time the nation held, when they said the nation held, they're talking about the Cherokee. The Cherokee was a nation. You understand? Before the Europeans came over here, your Native Americans or your Aboriginal indigenous people of the America, they were a nation. You understand? They always was a nation, and they built civilizations, and, they owned land, they owned resource, and things of that nature. They already had a civilization already going before the Europeans came here. And those Europeans were your elite Moors, who were dark-skinned, who came from Europe. But these were the lands that the Cherokee owned: West Virginia, Kentucky, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, South Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama. Historically, the nation was led by a principal chief, regularly elected by chiefs from Cherokee town within the nation's domain. So when we talk about the chiefs, we know that the chiefs were head of the tribes. And these chiefs got together and they had some type of political system already established before the Europeans came over here. And they already had treaties with each other. They already was trading and doing business with each other way before the Europeans came. And remember, when I say Europeans, I'm talking about your elite Moors, who also were black people. So when they talk about white people came over here and enslaved black people, that is not totally true. Black people enslaved black people. Your elite Moors that came from Europe, who were free, who had power, and they were looking for land and resource to expand out their empires, they were free. They were the ones that enslaved the Native Americans or indigenous blacks that were over here. The white people didn't come and assimilate themselves until later on. So the way they tell us history is wrong. I'm going to read some more, and then I'm going to get back into what I was talking about. It says the successive treaties with the British Crown and the United States reduced the Cherokee Nation original territories until by 1817, the remaining Cherokee lands covered an area consisted of southwestern North Carolina, southeastern Tennessee, northern eastern Alabama, and northern Georgia. Pressure to relinquish even more land within the nation, diminished territories were unrelenting. In 1817, enticed by the agents of the United States. When they talk about enticed by the agents of the United States, they're talking about your elite Moors, right, who created the United States Corporation. They were the ones that created the United States Corporation after they broke treaties and they took land and resource from the Native Americans. You understand? Remember, these are black people stealing from black people and enslaving black people and going to war with black people. So also killing black people. You understand? The European Caucasians didn't come later into this war and conflict amongst black people. Right? But it says right here, when these elite Moors came over here under the control of the British Crown, they wanted land and they wanted resource. You understand? They wanted land in the North Carolina. They wanted land in Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, so forth. And the pressure that they put on the Native Americans caused them to relinquish more and more land. You understand? It says that these black elite Moors were under the control of the British Crown. It says they, in 1817, they enticed by agents of the United States some residents of the Cherokee town in what is now far northwestern South Carolina, northern Georgia, abandoned what remains of the Cherokee homeland, and voluntarily opted to migrate west of the Mississippi. So this is where you get these elite Moors that came in and they started taking more land and resource, pushing the original Native Americans, who were your indigenous aboriginals, your 5 civilized tribes, your Cherokee, Choctaw, Muskogee, Seminole, so forth, pushing them more to the west. Pushing them to the west. You understand? West of the Mississippi. So that's why you got a lot of our ancestors that come from Mississippi. You understand? And there was something called The Trail of Tears, which is a good book, The Trail of Tears. Matter of fact, let me give y'all what The Trail of Tears was. Because The Trail of Tears was when these elite Moors that came from Europe, right, under the British Crown, which I have to understand, Britain, the royal crown of Britain, was all melanated black kings, queens, dukes, earls, barons, esquires, counts. They were people of high status that were affiliated with the royal crown and the royal throne. So Europe was controlled by Moors, by melanated Moors. You understand? King Henry was black. Queen Elizabeth was black. King George was black. All these people was black people. You understand? So when we talk about the British Crown coming over here and taking land and resource from your indigenous aboriginals that were already here, who already built civilization and already was doing business and things of that nature, this was what was going on. You had black people against black people before the Caucasians came. What's going on, cuzzos? Both cuzzos. What's good with y'all? So the Trail of Tears was a real important thing, because when these black elite Moors came over here under the control of the British Crown, they pushed the Native Americans west of the Mississippi. This is why they call it the Trail of Tears. And I want to let me read a little bit about the Trail of Tears. And it's a good book out. There's a lot of books on the Trail of Tears that you can read about how this whole thing took place. I can't go through the whole thing now. Maybe I will in some other time, but I want to give y'all a little just breakdown. It says the Trail of Tears was the forced displacement of about 60,000 people of the 5 civilized tribes. Remember, the 5 civilized tribes are your Cherokee, your Choctaw, your Chickasaw, your Muskogee, and your Seminoles. These were the 5 tribes that the elite Moors that came from Europe recognized and did business with and had treaties with. And they gave them land and resource. We allowed them to come over here and do business. It wasn't just a war. These people were around us for years before war even happened. Matter of fact, we considered them family. We considered them business partners. We shared traditions and customs and things of that nature before they backstabbed us or cut throat. You understand? And started taking land and resource away from us and started breaking the treaties that they had with us. You understand? But this led to the Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears was a forced displacement of about 60,000 people of the 5 civilized tribes between 1830 and 1850. So remember, United States, the first United States was 1776. Yeah, and the Creek tribes. 1776 is when the United States got their independence from Britain. Remember, Britain was black, all black royalty. And the ones that came over here were under the control and power and jurisdiction of the royal crown. but there was conflict between the royal crown and those ones that they sent over here to explore land and resource and to enslave people. They started to tax. The taxation thing is what caused the conflict. And I'm going to get to that because that's real important. But let's finish reading about this. So we see that this happened later on after the United States got their independence. Because you have to remember, the elite Moors that came from Europe, they teamed up with your indigenous Native Americans, your 5 tribes. And they went against the crown, the British crown, and got their independence. You understand? So after they got their independence, and after these Native Americans helped these elite Moors get their independence and break away from the royal crown, then a conflict happened amongst the elite Moors and your indigenous Native Americans, and they started fighting and warring. You understand? And that was the war between them. You understand? But this happened after 1776. Remember, George Washington became the president in 1871. That's when the second United States Corporation came into effect. So you had the first United States, which was put together by your indigenous Aboriginal tribes, your 5 civilized tribes, right? And then later on, your elite Moors come in, and they set up a United States, which was a corporation. You understand? So it says between 1830 and 1850, and the additional thousands of Native Americans and their black slaves. Here we got to dodge the sabotage of the truth. This is when they start sabotaging the truth. They tell you that between 1830 and 1850, and the additional 1,000 of Native Americans and their black slaves. No, there wasn't no black slaves. We never were slaves. These were black people. When we talk about these Native Americans, so-called Native Americans, they were black people. There wasn't no slavery, like chattel slavery, like with the Caucasians institutionalized. There wasn't that type of slavery. Was there wars? Were there fights? People taking hostage of people doing with tribal war? Yes, but there never was the form of chattel slavery that the Europeans articulated. Yeah, they fought and they went to war, but always we knew about peace. We always knew about coming together, resolving our differences, and coming together as peace. Yeah, because prisoners of war, you can call them prisoners of war, but they were allowed to keep their sovereignty. They knew how to read, they knew how to write, they knew math, they knew science, they knew engineering, they knew medicine. They didn't take away their humanity away from the people, even though if they had them as prisoner of war. And if you was a prisoner of war, the only thing you did was integrated into the tribe that took over you. They didn't hold you slavery. They still allowed you to make a living. They still allowed you to read, to write, no math, no science, and all this other stuff. It was just you took on their traditions and customs now. You understand? That's what a prisoner of war was. You understand? It wasn't like chattel slavery where they whipped you, hung you, and burned you and degraded you into an animal. You understand? So the slavery was different. You understand? So when they say right here between 1830 and 1850, and the additional thousands of Native Americans and black slaves, this is the sabotage of the truth. No, they all were Native Americans. You understand? And then it says, within, they were ethnically cleansed by the United States government. So when they talk about ethnically cleansed by the United States government, they're talking about your elite Moors that came over here from Europe and took land and resource and enslaved them. You understand? And then later on, your Mongoloid which they came before the elite Moors came and mixed them with Native Americans. You understand? And that's what happened with that situation. So when they say ethnically cleansed by the United States government, they're talking about the corporate United States that was under George Washington, which was incorporated in 1871. You understand? So I'm going to read some more, but I got to come back because I'm on a time thing. Yeah, so yo, cuz, come back, cuz I'm about to just shut it down and come back, cuz I just want to do 30 minutes and I'm gonna come back. So come back because I'm gonna finish the rest. You need to chime in with me. I can bring you in if you want to. So if you come back, me and you both probably can build. But come back.